view of people of color. And I do want to briefly introduce my whole panel. The first presenter will be Wendi-Starr Brown. And Wendi-Starr's background is she's a cultural anthropologist who works for the federal government. And in fact, she works for the U.S. Department of the Interior, the Office of Federal Acknowledgement, having to do with the acknowledgement of Indian tribes. She has a BA in anthropology with Native American Studies from Dartmouth, an MA in anthropology from Temple, and a PhD in the same subject at Temple as well. And the title of her dissertation was "The Church is the People, the Role of a Christian Church in a Native American Community." And her family has been instrumental in the Narragansett Church. And her research interest is still the Narragansett Indian Church and ties to the people. So she'll be our first speaker. Our next speaker will be Marcus Nevius, who is a professor of history at University of the Rhode Island. He earned his bachelor's degree and his master's degree in history from North Carolina Central University and his PhD from Ohio State. And his areas of research include slavery, slave resistance, and especially marronage. That's slaves who ran away and were able to hide and be successful at it, and slavery-based economies and abolition. And he's written a book called City of Refuge, Slavery and Debt, Marronage in the Great Dismal Swamp. And that's a big swamp area between North Carolina and Virginia. The third presenter will be Debbie Suggs, and Debbie has quite a background as well. She has her BA in history from Rhode Island College, where she concentrated on Rhode Island colonial history, and her MA in public administration from URI, and she's currently the director of admissions for special populations at URI. She's been an adjunct instructor at URI and College Unbound, Providence, and she's presented numerous workshops and seminars on Rhode Island history, folklore, and ancestry. As an activist, she was a leader of the successful effort to change the name of the state of Rhode Island. So we're no longer the smallest state in the country with the longest name. You know, she got rid of the end of that name, thank goodness. Okay, so she's done that, and she's working to improve Rhode Island history education in the state's public schools. And her current research interest is documenting the lives of enslaved people through the exploration of historical cemeteries and family records. And then, last but not least, is Shirley Swann Green. And Shirley Green earned her bachelor's and a master's in history at the University of Toledo and her PhD at the Bowling Green State University. And her areas of research has been early American history, especially colonial history in Rhode Island, and genealogical research. She is retired. She's had a career as a police officer and retired as lieutenant. And in her retirement, well, for a while she was deputy mayor of Toledo, Ohio. At this time, she's the director of the Police Museum in Toledo and an adjunct professor in history and criminology, teaching both at University of Toledo and at Bowling Green State University. In her Rhode Island connection, she's done a lot of her research here in Rhode Island. We're first cousins, and we're descended from soldiers who were in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, who were brothers. Mm-hmm. One brother switched sides and ended up in Canada, and we're descended from that one. And the other brother stayed in Rhode Island until after 1790 and then took off for the territory. I think he took off for New Orleans. So
I'll be talking about them tonight, Donna.
Yes, definitely. So anyway, so that's pretty much it. And her dissertation title is Freeborn Men of Color, the Frank Brothers in Revolutionary North America between 1755 and 1820. So anyway, what we'll do, let's start with Wendi-Starr Brown, who will talk a bit about the indenture of Narragansett people.
Yes, hi. Happy to meet you all. You know, the subject regarding Native American bondage is actually, it's not new. It's been known. It's just not one that gets a lot of press, and that's across the country. That's from coast to coast, not just in the Northeast, but into you can look at various and there is now scholarship where people are actually looking at how Native people were pressed into service in one way or another by in California, for example, because I did some research there not very long ago, where if an Indian was considered a vagrant, they could be sold to somebody, to whoever took them. And so they weren't officially, and it was supposed to be the the idea, or at least they put it so that it wouldn't be exactly slavery. Like, well, it's sort of, they'll work off the debt. But of course, it just transferred into, a form of involuntary servitude that lasted, a long time. The Northeast has its own history that's being uncovered. I regret to this day, I was in a lecture one time with a woman who had found and working with records, and she was saying the idea that there are no records for Indians, even in the Northeast, particularly is just absolutely wrong. People just don't know where to look for them. They show up in many places, including what she said that she had located records of Indians in what is it called, the galley slaves in Napoleon's army that were sold there from King Philip's War. And to this day, I wish that I had gotten that exact reference, because that has got to have been a fascinating detail of how these captives from King Philip's War ended up in the galleys of Napoleon ships going against Napoleon. But yeah, so the documentation does exist. People have known about it, they just don't talk about it. And there's probably multiple reasons for that. I'm sorry if I'm jiggling around here. I'm working on my iPad because my laptop camera is not functional. But after you have King Philip's War, which is really, if you grow up in New England, it's kind of amazing how many people outside of New England have no clue what you're talking about when you say King Philip's War. But in the aftermath of King Philip's War, you do have this mass indenture of natives, and it's not just Narragansett, it's natives from all over what is now considered southern New England. So you don't, and there was supposed to have been a formula that if you were above a certain age, you served for so many years, and if you were under, children are the ones who ended up serving the longest. You also have the policy of bonding out children. If a child was born and their parents couldn't take care of them, or didn't, or for however the circumstances it could be, that they would be bound out to someone for a period of years, and they were supposed to have been instructed and learn a trade, or not, or they just had them. They could do whatever they wanted to them, really. And then they were supposed to be released from this service after a certain amount of time, with maybe if, depending on how the contract was written, they would be given maybe a suit of clothes or whatever to start them on their way afterwards. But there's all these different ways that Indian labor was obtained, whether coerced but certainly definitely obtained, that's really understudied. And I think that that now that more and more records have become available, that more and more people are open to looking at this subject, that we're going to see more of this research coming out. I think Ruth Herndon worked for a long time with Ella Secatal, who was a tribal member, and the tribal medicine woman. And they did a lot of research in records regarding the Narragansett children who were and other people who were in these contracts, who were in indentures or who were bound out. And it's so there's certainly more to be done. There's also another scholar out of UMass Amherst, Alice Nash. She's done work in that area. So there is more, plenty. There's work that has been done. There is so much more that can be done. It's a very interesting subject. There was another book that was released within the past, I think, 3 years that looked at the whole continental history of natives and slavery, and how that one of the reasons that not as that the slave so there's actually a link that the slave trade in Africa became so prominent in the New World because of disease. People forget about the role of disease, that the natives didn't have the resistance to disease that the people from the old world already did, and they were like, well, they keep dying on us. They're just economically, it's painful, it's dehumanizing, which is exactly what the idea was. But that if the idea of thinking that, gee, if natives had more resistance to some of those old world diseases, what would that transatlantic slavery endeavor have looked like? If, in other words, if it was like they got here, they could already take advantage of this population instead of having to go to a whole other continent and take advantage of that. So there's many questions to be answered regarding that.
Okay. Okay. I think what I'll do, any thoughts or questions before I move on to the next speaker? Any reaction one way or another?
I just have one reaction for Wendy, because this is one of those examples of it, such a small world, but Ruth Herndon was my dissertation advisor
Was she
at
really?
at Bowling Green State University. That is how small the world is.
It certainly is. And she did, I met her once or twice, particularly to discuss because the work that she had done with Ella. And I can't remember the title of her book, but again, I think she was also she had done. No, I'm sorry, I'm confusing her with somebody else. I was thinking of Revolutionary War records because I know your interest with Revolutionary War as well.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I've looked at again one of the other things that makes it a little bit difficult is that sometimes we don't know exactly the records. We know there were people of native descent, but sometimes we're not entirely sure what tribe it is. It's, they could be Pequot, they could have been Narragansett, they could have been Wampanoag, they could have been, any of these people, but they're just down in the book as, maybe Indian, or sometimes if they're down as mulatto, sometimes, all these racial categories that we're realizing are far more nebulous than we ever thought they were before. But but I think that, history being what it is, there is not as much in the way of oral history. On the other hand, it's been several hundred years regarding it. But I did run across a record, and it was a long time ago, and it was a tale of an old. And he said he went to an Indian man went to the state house or the state capitol, whatever it was at the time, and said what his name was, and I don't know why I didn't preserve this record. What his name was, he said, "I am a captive from King Philip's War. I have served my indenture and I want to be released now. I have done my time. Let me go." And as far as I know, he was, and what happened to his life beyond then? Did he go back? Did he leave entirely and go wherever he could have gone? I'm not sure. Did he learn the skill while he was there that he was able to take and make his way into the new world that he found himself in? I wish I knew, but someday I'll go to, since I'm planning on living forever and I can go back through all of those papers I've collected the year, I can put my hand on that record and see if I can find out what happened to that man who, at least we have one record of at least one person who was able to say, I survived the war, I survived my indenture, and now I want to live the rest of my life unmolested and unbothered by these constraints.
What would you say were some of the results of slavery experienced by the Narragansett?
Well, it's okay. So we need to. So there's a little bit of a difference. I mean, not a little bit of a difference, but chattel slavery, the sort of total complete control, is different than an indenture, where at least there's at least supposed to be an endpoint. Whether or not people legally manage to finagle their way around it by saying the person hasn't served or taking advantage of it or whatever, that's another issue. But still, at the end of it, see, this is the thing. I wish that nobody ever sat down, or at least if there's a record, and maybe it exists somewhere in some dusty town hall, that would say so and so who was indentured to so and so for however long, has returned to the community or something. If there was something that would actually give us some idea of what happened to those people once they came back. But certainly we can at least conjecture that the skills that would have been learned, if they were serving in, like I said, in this new world that they found themselves in, if they learned how to handle, they learned how to handle the animals. They learned maybe how to be a cooper, how to, how to do maybe a blacksmith, whatever. And certainly we know the Narragansetts have a long history of stonemasonry. Whether or not they learned, improved, or however, I mean, there was some indigenous as well, but if they took the additional skills that they had learned through that and used that to better the community. I wish that being that I find myself as a 21st century person, I want to see it in writing. I want to see the written record. I want to be able to say to somebody, this is not just something I'm hypothesizing. This is something I actually have a written record of. I have not seen, I do not know, and I don't know if they exist. I don't know if they did exist and they no longer exist, but like I said, I can conjecture that some of the skills certainly that would have been learned in households would have then been taken back to improve their own, whether or not the one thing I do not know about, and I do not believe that literacy was part of that. I do know, of course, the Narragansetts did have a school and had one since Eleazar Wheelock first showed up, and one of his students taught in a wigwam down in the Narragansett country. But the practical skills that might have come out of working with livestock and other things that persist, that go on and help the Narragansett community persist and maintain itself throughout the centuries until recent days. What role do they have? Like I said, I wish I could have some of those, to be able to firmly have a straight line. And I don't quite yet, but again, since I plan on living forever, maybe I can do that. Maybe that would be the, if someday to sit down with maybe some records from some dusty town in the town hall in Charleston, whatever, and see if I could actually get a link between stonemasonry and if that had been something, or the modifications of stonemasonry that enabled the Narragansett men to earn a trade that way. If women who were working outside the home, if they were taking the housekeeping skills and doing it like that, but it could not have hurt to have learned these new skills, because the world was changing so fast, and it was such a different way than had been prior to the King Philip's War and the time afterwards. The number of people that survived and came through that, and the internal political changes among the tribe itself through that, the relationship with the colony and then with the state of Rhode Island. That's also, inflicting this, bringing all of these other changes onto people. Again, the people, the connection between those who were indentured and those who hadn't been, those who managed to maintain themselves and then dealt with returnees, when people came back. What was their, relationship? Again, these are things I keep thinking about. And if I don't get to live forever, then I'd like to invent the time machine so I can go back and see for myself what happened on the ground. We don't know everything, but and we speculate on a few things, but there's a world of things to even contemplate that I think new techniques, new availability of more and more documentation on these things. I think that in the next few years, we're going to see some really exciting things come out. We're going to learn a lot that was always there to begin with, but we just didn't have access to it, and we'll get access to it through these new techniques.
Okay, any other thoughts or questions before we move on to our next speaker?
Wendi, I just think I have one quick thought now. Recently, I've heard more and more people here in Rhode Island talking about the indentured or slash enslavement of the indigenous people, specifically the Narragansetts, in many ways led to between, frankly, wars, assimilation, shipping Narragansetts throughout the West Indies had literally led in many ways to the almost decimation or genocide of the Narragansett population or the indigenous populations in this area. I just was curious as to your thoughts on that kind of statement.
Well, certainly, you know, we're dealing when we certainly know that after the King Philip's War, that we know a large number of people were sold into that's another thing that the Pequots actually they have the resources and to do it, but they began, I believe, to explore what happened to the war captives who had actually been sold into the Caribbean, and to try to make connections there. We know that happened. You know, there's also, you know, the people in Massachusetts who I think it's Deer Island, where a number of people were sold, and that was that temporary prison that ended up, you know, shipping people all across and outside here down to the islands. You know, so yeah, so we know that a lot of people died. A lot of people were removed and they died because you know, but was it, you know, I mean, yeah, when we say genocide, we say that there are some people who want a more strict version of genocide. I think it's pretty good if you can almost eliminate people. The difference, though, is that there was always a few people who were identified. That's one of the things when I'm doing my historical research, is that those wars and those other things, they did decimate, no question, decimate, not a thing. But there always was a group that was claiming and maintaining itself. I mean, you have King Tom down there on his farm. You have the merger of the Niantics and the well, not merger, but they were already Narragansetts, but the Niantics coming to the forefront for the Narragansetts down in the southern part of the state. So it's not the same. It's never that sort of complete erasure, you know, or even the attempt of a complete erasure. One of the things, like, for example, in California, against some of the native peoples there, it was even considered, one of the policies was just to erase the name. I mean, there was not even an attempt was made with Pequot. I mean, there was, you know, I believe there was a paper that was written years ago, and they were talking about how there was that with Pequot, not only was the attempt made to kill all of the people with, you know, the attack on the fort, and then kill, but to actually forbid the speaking of the name, like to just basically say these people never existed at all, you know, so total erasure. We didn't suffer that same fate. There was always some folks who were there who were saying, we're Narragansetts, we're Niantics, you know, you need to pay attention to us, you need to, you know, whether or not they were being ignored, that's another thing. But there was, you know, so that tag of the genocide fortunately never happened, but the decimation, no question, between the wars, and if you want to say cultural genocide, again, I'll say cultural decimation, because there were always those who were able to maintain. We've maintained more of our culture than a lot of people want to give us credit for. You know, yeah, you know, I'm not sure why so many people believe that Native Americans need to be frozen in amber, you know, that the only Native is one who exists exactly at first contact. You know, if it's not Pocahontas or, you know, some Sitting Bull, then they're somehow invalid. You know, I've always said, well, how many people today live like their ancestors lived 400 years ago? You know, why is it we're the only people who are expected to be frozen and everybody else is allowed to change? You know, it doesn't make them any less authentically Italian or Swedish or Swiss or, you know, whatever, but somehow Native people, immediately know if they're not Indian anymore because they drive cars, or, you know, just silly things like that. But so we're able to maintain more culture, like I said, than people give us credit for. And people are making attempts, not only just Narragansetts, but our other fellow New England tribes. I know you've probably seen some of the work regarding language resurrection that's been being done with the Wampanoag. So people are making efforts to try and do the best they can to deal again with the world they find themselves in. But all of these things, war, like I said before, the role of disease, which doesn't get as looked at as often as it should. The something like the mass indenture of people that spreads them out, takes them away from each other for years and years, and then at the end leaves people at, we don't know whether they how they end up. They sometimes get lost, sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. We're not really sure. All of these things have contributed to the problems that Native people in New England, specifically, this is what we're talking about here, have suffered. Just one quick thing. I know there's others people wanting to speak, but there's a book many years ago, and I do not remember the author's name, but it is a fictional book, but it is about a Narragansett boy who was captured and indentured to I think it was a shoemaker or something in Boston. And it's an odd little book. I don't know if anybody, I think maybe I'm the only person who read it, me and the guy who wrote it, because I've never heard it discussed. But it at least made an effort. At least I had to give it credit for addressing a topic from the point of a child being put and learning how to be a shoemaker or whatever it was he was doing in colonial Boston, and which was more than I had seen for that period of history for others. So anyway, the information is out there. The Native people have suffered under all of these different regimes, whether it's economic, social, bureaucratic, but nevertheless, we're still here. We're different than we were 400 years ago, but I challenge anybody to tell me who's not different than they were 400 years ago. We're all working through the world we find ourselves in, and trying to, and taking as much as we can from the past to inform to maintain ourselves as Narragansett people, and to bring ourselves into the future that way. And and we are still learning.
Okay. Next speaker will be Marcus Nevius, who will take a comparative approach to slavery. I'm not sure whether it will be over time or over geography, but anyway, I will leave the table to him. Pass the mic to Marcus, yes.
Thank you, Donna. First of all, let me say it'll be quite an experience to follow Wendy's awesome reflections, but I'll do my best to perhaps approach what I'd like to share this evening from the perspective of an historian who is very much steeped in the scholarship, present and past, and who frankly portrays himself to be a scholar of the history of slavery, not necessarily attached to place as much as it is the scholarship itself and the way in which that scholarship has shaped and continues to shape the United States and the world today. I'll begin by listing 5 books that I often assign in my history of slavery course at the University of Rhode Island that have very much been influential in my studies, that I've cited in my first book, and that I always recommend to people who are interested in the subject as it relates to Rhode Island and beyond. And frankly, I hope that this is useful for an audience of folks who themselves are interested in books, seeing as we're having this discussion for the South Kingstown Library this evening. 2 books from 2015 come to mind right away. Wendy Warren's New England Bound and Margaret Ellen Newell's Brethren by Nature. These 2 books attempt to synthesize the deepening scholarship that Wendy has discussed previously of Native American history in the 17th and early 18th century in New England in ways that, at least speaking to academic audiences, seek to engage with the 100 or so years of scholarship, antiquarian histories, and then eventually institutional histories in a context of changing ideas about the history of slavery that in and of themselves were particularly generated in the wake of Brown University's efforts to investigate its own institutional relationship with the history of slavery. Margaret Newell was actually on my dissertation committee at Ohio State. And so I know her to be a wonderful human being. Her book, I will particularly say, even with the measure of awe that I just explained here, does a really good job of laying out the story of Native American history in Rhode Island in the 17th century, and actually makes reference to what Wendi, I think, was referencing with regard to the transport of King Philip's war captives away from Rhode Island in the wake of the war. They actually, scholars know, were transported to Providence Island. I'm sorry, that might have been in the wake of the earlier war, the Pequot War. It definitely was. In the wake of the Pequot War, excuse me, transported to Providence Island, which was off the coast of Central America, a British colony that did not last longer than the 1640s. And in that same book, evidence of further transportations of enslaved Native Americans away from Rhode Island to the Caribbean, though documentation is very difficult to trace beyond Rhode Island, although I'm aware of several scholars, perhaps including Linwood Fisher at Brown, who are attempting to take up this work currently, to again speak to Wendi's discussion that new work is coming and new work will essentially put forward new ideas and new ways to frame these histories. Another influential book is by a historian we might all know well because she's local, Joanne Pope Mellish, who in 1998 published Disowning Slavery, which was a book that addressed the cultural amnesia around the history of slavery in Rhode Island. This book was published in 1998 and was certainly influenced by the cultural turn in academic histories that shaped the 1980s and 1990s. But in this book particularly, we learn that over time, from the American Revolutionary era into about the 1820s and 1830s, there was, as a part of a political backlash and a cultural backlash, a concerted effort to reframe, reshape, and otherwise redraft the history of the region, New England, and of Rhode Island particularly, such that its history of slavery was largely forgotten in the academic space and largely silenced in the public space, except for in places where locally communities might attempt to engage these histories. And that sort of forgetting had a serious result, which in no uncertain terms resulted, for example, in the context in which George Howe's famous History of Bristol, Rhode Island appeared in the 1950s, frankly forgetting the Wolf's relationship to slavery in creating that town, not to mention the fact that the town itself was very much a center of transatlantic slave trading in the 19th century. Another book from about 15 or so years ago is John Wood Sweet's Bodies Politic, which is probably still the best study of the extant documents that can be traced in local Rhode Island archives, and essentially explains that over a century, between the mid-17th century and the mid-18th century, in concerted efforts to establish the state of Rhode Island in a broader world, of course, of transatlantic slave trading, that Native American dispossessions of land and amnesia to the history of Native Americans in this land, frankly, became not only a reality, which Wendi summarized earlier, but also a part of the body politic of the state as well. And more broadly, a methodology that was repeated the nation round, especially in the 19th century, as the new federal republic moved into the South and West, and as Native Americans found increasingly their ancestral lands under attack in this context. And then finally, is a recent book by an historian named Christy Clark Pujara, who we had visit Rhode Island just several years ago, called Dark Work, which again revisits the history of slavery in Rhode Island, but with a particular emphasis on the implications that that history had for Black community formation in the early 19th century. And of the books that I just mentioned, it's probably the most lucid, accessible reading of this current history, particularly as it relates to our current moment of attempting to engage with these histories in ways that inform our present. With the time that I have remaining this evening, I'd like to follow that brief sort of summary of, I think, 5 really good books by setting them against a broader framework that I think will be helpful for our conversation this evening and going forward. And that broader framework is an important historical reality that I think we must foreground, and that frankly will help us to deal with the deepest implications of these histories of slavery. Slavery was a human condition in ancient times, in early modern times, in the recent past that we're discussing, and presently it remains for many people around the world a human condition. This didn't necessarily make it right at any context, and this certainly created a situation where slavery has long been, at least for those who pay attention to the inequities it produces, a moral problem, if not a deeper problem in any of the ways that it's been framed previously. One need only consider the Bible to find examples of this. One need only consider the story of the Israelites' escape from Egypt, for example, or one need only consult ancient history to consider the ways in which the Romans enslaved people beyond the center of the Roman Empire, or the ways that other empires, even in Africa, attempted the same. And indeed, too, and this I think is often most forgotten in the context of New England's history, English people too, according to a recent history by an historian named Michael Guasco in a book called Slaves and Englishmen, English people too understood that in this broader world of enslavement, they might be in certain circumstances enslaved themselves. This was particularly the case when English travelers traveled throughout the Mediterranean world, and when they encountered what were known as the Barbary states, or the polities on the North African Mediterranean coast, where sometimes in engaging in efforts to trade in markets and places today, such as Tunisia, they might find themselves enslaved as well. And that particular context for slavery, which unfolded in the 16th century, the 1500s, immediately predated the context of enslavement, which unfolded in the 17th century North American colonies that England ultimately is at the forefront of establishing. And in Guasco's book particularly, we learn of the way in which an ethos of slavery as a human condition becomes increasingly narrow in cultural application, and eventually in legal and social applications too, assigned to Native Americans where in certain circumstances in the 17th century, Native Americans could be taken advantage of in that way. And then ultimately for people of the African diaspora after about the mid 17th century. And I think there's one more important thing to note here that helps us to sort of understand the way in which that world unfolds. And that is the relatively rapid expansion of transatlantic slave trading away from the African coast, which begins to unfold after the 1640s and really explodes after the 1690s, at about the same time that the British ultimately established themselves as the world's most networked purveyors of enslaved Africans in this Atlantic world. It's in this way that we begin to understand, at least for the purposes of considering the lessons we seek to share, that by the 1740s, the British are really at the forefront of carrying enslaved people forcibly across the Atlantic Ocean. And this is the same context that stories such as Venture Smith's life unfold, or stories such as Olaudah Equiano's, the particular life that he shares in his narrative, unfolds. The moral undertones of slavery and the moral inequities particularly that form the critiques of anti-slavery movements, which begin about the mid-18th century and really take off after the American Revolution, are in part one way that we can begin to consider how the emphasis for slavery or lack of increasing or lack of maintaining justification for slavery, I mean to say, begins to change. But even still, it's important for us to note a few key things, I think, and I think I'll conclude with a few more notes. In 1774, the Rhode Island General Assembly bans the transatlantic slave trade, or at least bans permission for its merchants to participate in the transatlantic slave trade. But that doesn't mean these merchants don't try to continue, as the story of the Browns and the story of the DeWolfs have increasingly made clear. 10 years later, as Wendy mentioned earlier, in 1784, the General Assembly passed the Gradual Emancipation Bill, which set the terms for, after March 1st, 1784, the release from slavery for people who had been enslaved 18 years on from 1784 for women born after that date, and 21 years on for men born after that date. But even that didn't mean that slavery came to a legal end in Rhode Island, because in part, the state's constitution was not amended by the passage of these laws. And the state's constitution would not be amended in such a way to positively outlaw slavery in Rhode Island until after the Dorr Rebellion of 1843, when the new state constitution no longer included a provision that supported slavery in the state of Rhode Island. And the last caveat, that moment unfolds as Rhode Island is now one of the centers in the northern United States for the production of cotton cloths that are sold southward, and frankly, that the production of these textile goods undergirds the economy of the state in such a way that has made an indelible imprint on people's remembered histories of Rhode Island even today. And so even when we consider that great moment of industrial revolution in Rhode Island, it cannot be separated from the history of slavery in the broader United States.
All right, any questions or thoughts for Marcus Nevius? Wendy, you may need to unmute.
There we go. Hi. No, all I was just curious was I was trying to take some of the notes of some of the titles that you'd mentioned. I didn't know if we would assemble some kind of bibliography afterwards, or a reading list for because some of these works I'd really like to. I'm going to investigate them myself, but if anybody wanted to, I just didn't know if we would compile something like that.
I'll jump in here a minute. We have a wonderful bibliography of all these works and more that was put together by our local history librarian, Jessica Wilson. So I will make sure that all the ones that Marcus mentioned are on it. And there's extensive right from our webpage, skpl.org. So, but great.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, any other questions or thoughts?
Actually, one other thing I'm getting it back a little bit to what you were talking about the people on Providence Island, and that, the transfer as well. One of the things that does, which I'm not sure why, but the width of the amount that, one of the things that I think that gets overlooked, I think, is how often Native people who were enmeshed in, if you want to call it slavery or whatever you want to call it, how actually far they ended up traveling from home. One of the people who I think is an example, and it's right in front of our eyes, and there's the history, but it hasn't been looked at very much until recently, would be Tituba in Plymouth. and so
Oh
Salem,
my.
because Tituba was from Venezuela.
Oh my goodness.
And when I would see and years ago, I had always read that Tituba was an Indian woman who did this. But then as the research got older, I thought she was a local. And then it was, no, she was actually from, but then recently I think they were saying that they think that she was actually from somewhere around Venezuela originally and ended up in Massachusetts, and she was married apparently to a man who was known, I think his name was Indian John, whether he was a local Indian or if he was also part of that diaspora, for lack of a better term. But and also somebody like, we just finished with Thanksgiving, but good old Squanto, who ended up in England for all those years and made it back. The width of the networks and the way that people were traveling in ways that are pretty astonishing is something that it gets mentioned here, there, a little bit, but does not go any further. And it's pretty amazing that it doesn't, that we have not sat down and actually said, or basically made the statement that these things, people were traveling and going across immense distances in relationship to these various and sundry owners, master, whatever you wanted to call them, as being servants to them. And it's pretty, and it's something that just doesn't get talked about. And I've had a period to that, but I can't end it. So sorry. They just came to my mind as people who were who were very wide ranging, not just a local thing, that they ended up very far from home.
Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? If not, let's go to Debbie. And Debbie will talk about conflict between slaveholding families and also her discovery from her cemetery research too.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. So fascinating. I'm a little nervous now because you guys were excellent, and now I'm like, uh-oh. let me talk about my subject. I'm going to talk a little different, I think, about my subject. I think that I've come about my interest in slavery in Rhode Island in a little bit of a different way than some people. It's not necessarily an academic way. It's just a little different. So let me talk a little bit about my identity as a person. And it's so funny because I identify as part of my identity as a Rhode Islander. My family has been in this state for 360 years. My mom's family floated over on the Mayflower, walked their way over to Rhode Island, and we're here. And that's been part of my family's folklore, my family's history. We've talked about, I'm a direct descendant of Roger Williams, of the Tillinghast family, of all these Rhode Island families that I've been quite proud of. And years back, I started really working on ancestry. I won't lie to you. I won't tell you when your family hasn't left, 36 miles of land in 360 years, it's not all that difficult to do ancestry. So I started working on ancestry and looking at my family stuff on my mom's side again, and was shocked. What? We were slave owners? How is that? Could that be possible? I read it again and again, and I was like, oh, how can I be so proud of people as slave owners? A little bit about my family history on my dad's side. My dad is African-American. He is a descendant, a direct descendant from slaves. So how can I be proud of people that are slaves? And who knew that Rhode Island people, quote unquote, own slaves? So like Marcus said, in a way, Rhode Islanders have a little amnesia, and we're taught. I've been a public school student since I was hatched here. And nobody talked about Rhode Islanders outside of the Brown family and maybe the DeWolf family trading in slaves. They didn't talk about owning slaves. They talked about trading in slaves. So then I learned a little bit, okay, so maybe there were some slaves in Rhode Island. Then I did a museum visit and saw the picture of the Narragansett Planters. And I said, what is that? As I grew up in Narragansett. I went to high school, elementary school in Narragansett. I said, what's that painting? And they said, that's a painting of the Narragansett Planters, the plantations that were throughout South County or Kings County or whatever you call it. What do you mean plantations? We had plantations. So like any good Rhode Islander, like you said, Marcus, a little amnesia in 1800s led to not knowing anything in the 1900s about the real history of my state. So really, I decided that I needed to learn more. And I will tell you, 10 years ago, when the ballot question came up about changing the state's name, removing plantation, I voted against the move. I said, absolutely not. That's a part of our history. That doesn't mean Roger Williams and his people, they never meant plantations. They never, because we're Rhode Island. We didn't have slaves like that. Rhode Islanders didn't think like that. That was my knowledge 10 years ago. Research growing up, doing them a little bit more, said, wait a minute, we did have slaves and my people were slave owners. And that picture to me almost changed my philosophy and made me very involved as actually one of the leaders in changing the state's name and removing plantations. So what have I been doing? I looked at my town, the town I grew up in, Narragansett, and looked at some of the names, the Hazards, the Perrys, the Niles family, Watsons, Babcocks, Updikes, all these people, and started looking into their history and looking into, quite frankly, my Rhode Island history as a descendant of some of those folks. And was shocked. So I look now and I look where I work. Let me give you an example. I work at the University of Rhode Island, like Donna said, walking through campus, walking into the South lobby at the Ryan Center 8 million zillion times to go to basketball games. Finally, a couple of years ago, looked to the left and saw the Niles Family Cemetery. What is that Niles Family Cemetery? It's not the Niles Family Cemetery. It's the Niles. It was their servants and slave cemetery. And really taking the time then to read that and say, I need to know more about these Niles people, who they are. And not necessarily the Niles family, but the people who worked for the Niles, the servants, the slaves, the people that were forced to work on this great plantation, call it a farm, plantation. So the problem I found is you don't learn everything. And you guys have found this, Wendi, you mentioned it when you're looking at indigenous, there's nothing really documented about these people. There's man sold, boy sold, woman sold, an occasional name here and there. So my goal then sort of switched to, yep, I'm going to try to figure out who these people were. I will look at the families to see what kind of industry they were involved in. So there I can start looking at the kind of things the people on their plantations did. So looking at the Niles family, looking at their backgrounds, reading their documents, they were primarily involved in cheese making. So they had a large dairy facility where the Niles family, after coming over with purchasing land down here, along with Roger Williams and all those folks, Niles family at any given time owned 45 to 50 slaves working on their property. Whether the slave was Black or indigenous or Narragansett, we don't know. There's no real notes. There's notes of some names at the time that the patriarch at the family died. He did identify 11 slaves, although, like I said, there were 45 to 50 people believed to live on this property. I find it now, it's my responsibility, and part of my work on the remove plantation from the state's name was to get the information out to the popular, to Rhode Island, about the Niles family, and more importantly, the enslaved people who worked the Niles family farm. Moving on from the Niles family, right now I've learned so much. You guys have all been to Smith's Castle. I've been to the Strawberry Festival at Smith's Castle 100 times. Well, it's once a year, so I guess maybe not 100, but I've been to that Strawberry Festival and never really thought about the people that worked on that property under the Updike family. And that Smith's Castle was at one time one of the largest plantations in the colonies and one of the very largest plantations in New England with 1,300 acres of property that went into Wickford. And then I sort of stand there and look, and I see when I go to Wickford now, I was there today, standing in Updike Park, walking down Updike Road, taking pictures of this and that. And then in the back of my mind thinking, you know what, it's great, it's a beautiful park. We're celebrating slave owners. The Updike family not only owned plantations and slaves on a plantation, they too, and this was new learning for me, that Wickford was a slave port. That Wickford ships sailed out of Wickford is participating in the triangle trade. So again, really trying to learn about the people who not only were the owners of those people, the enslaved folks, but trying to learn as much as I can about the people that were enslaved. One of the great things about the Updike family is they kept detailed notes with names. So they talked about who their enslaved people were. Some of it is heartbreakingly sad. You know, three-year-old boy John worth $10 sold to this person or that person, or one person and their slaves, Domini Smith. His value, nothing. He was valued at nothing. So like I read that and I say, how do you call a human being? But at least I know somebody was there. So my goal now is to find out where Domini was, where he lived after being enslaved, once he was released from the Updikes, if he was, and by the way, he was, and where he's buried now, and to literally visit that cemetery and say, you know what, talking to myself like many of us do, hey Domini, I recognize you and I recognize your contributions, kind of thing. One of the saddest things that for me right now is Rhode Island has thousands of historical cemeteries, thousands. Right now, the only well-kept cemetery that documents enslaved and African-American folks, and in many cases, indigenous populations, is God's Little Acre in Newport. Not less than a mile from my house, though, and I live right next to URI, well, less than a mile from my house is one of the largest slave cemeteries in New England. So have I visited? Trying to, can't find it. It's been unrecognized. Or unkept is probably the better word. So the last time it was explored was in the late 1800s. Now where to find it? That is we talked about missions, Wendy, if we live forever. I'm not going until I find the cemetery. Not for the pure joy, but to just stand there and say, I recognize that you existed. You existed beyond a notation in the Gardner-Stanton family records. And that's the Gardner-Stanton family cemetery that is less than a mile somewhere in the woods of Stony Fort Road. So that's some of the stuff I've tried to do. I've, funny enough, a family cemetery, another Gardner family. I don't know what you guys know of the Gardner family. You don't hear of them much anymore. You hear more of the Hazards and the Stantons and the Potters and the Robinsons, but the Gardner family were one of the largest landholding families in southern Rhode Island. Gardner family came over with William Coddington over to Newport. Mr. Gardner George met up with the Stanton family and purchased, and I always say purchase, quote unquote, purchased land from the Narragansetts over here. And the Gardners became one of the largest property owners. They continued to buy land throughout this area straight through to Westerly. And again, one of the largest slaveholding families in the area. Their property was often referred to, and they were often referred to as the Little South. People used to say the southern part of Rhode Island is very reminiscent or similar to the southern states. The plantations might not be as big, but the society and the cultural behaviors of the planters are very similar to the southern plantations, and the Gardners were among them. There is a Gardner cemetery, they call it servant cemetery, servant/slave cemetery, that's located on the grounds of the veteran cemetery. Frighteningly enough, it's unkept. Here we are on the veteran cemetery. If you walk through, it's beautifully, beautifully done in the veteran cemetery. Go further a little bit into the woods, into the historical cemeteries, there is the slave cemetery that probably hasn't been raked out or done anything with in 50 years. So my mission is to try to find, I'm not going to find them all, but try to find some of these, and at least somewhere, whether it's social media, whether it's for myself, whether it's writing, whether it's discussions like this, remember these people through talking about the history of slavery in Rhode Island. And that's been sort of my mission. Another thing I talk about, again, keep going back to you, Marcus, it's why I didn't have any statements before. Again, reminding people of the amnesia. I just did a program today with one of the public high schools talking about slavery in Rhode Island for one of their seminars, and talked about Roger Williams. What do we learn? What do we know about Roger? Great guy for religious freedom, was all about his friendship with the Indians and this and that. And then I said to the students, how many of you have heard that Roger Williams sold Native Americans after the King Philip's War? How many of you know that? Shock, no noise, no sounds. Guess what? I'm a descendant of Roger Williams. I did not know that until 3 years ago. I ran across it and I said, oh, you can't be looking through the papers, and noticed that his son and his son Providence and Roger Williams, after King Philip War, actually held one of the largest slave auctions, if you want to call it that, at the time, where they sold Native Americans, Narragansetts, Pequots, indigenous people of Rhode Island outside of Rhode Island. The key was not to sell them inside Rhode Island, to sell them out. So men went down to the West Indies and the plantations down there. Women and children were sold throughout New England. Roger Williams himself purchased Native Americans who were part of Massachusetts groups. Because again, you're not going to keep somebody in their home. That's how you ask for rebellion. And people say, and I hear you when you're saying that Roger and people they talked about indentured of Native Americans. But in truth, Roger Williams didn't expect that those people he sold to the West Indies were going to make their way back. He didn't expect they were going to get back here. Yeah. And in a time period when life expectancies were relatively short, when you indentured somebody for 45 years or something, you really were indenturing them for their lifetime. And one of the kids said to me today, he said, did you think Roger tried to hide all that? That's why we didn't know it? I said, no. I don't think Roger tried to hide it. Marcus, I wish I had thought about the amnesia thing, but I didn't at the time. I think what happens is our heroes over history, we lose the truth behind them. I say to the students, and I said to people when the argument against removing the name plantations, people, adults, young people, old people, newscasters all said Roger Williams did not know that's what plantations was going to end up being. And what Roger wasn't a dummy. And there were already plantations. I know plantations means big industrial farms, but there were already places in this world, on the continent, where plantations were worked by enslaved people. So Roger was not unaware of that. And more importantly, Roger Williams was not an abolitionist.
Wow.
And that's what I have to remind people. Quakers during that time weren't abolitionists. The Stanton family were Quakers. They sold enslaved. The Browns were Quakers. The Hazard family, many of the Hazards were Quakers, and they were adamant against slavery, but had no problem engaging in the trade of slave cloth and slave materials. And I look at documents. I have a pile in front of me that I printed of diary entries from their trips down to the plantations in the Carolinas and Virginia. There's one that said in a 3-week period, one of the Hazard gentlemen, traveled to about 200 plantations selling cloth and gathering, making contracts for cotton. So whether they supported slavery somehow, whether they engaged in actually owning folks or helping the industry, we were involved in. And I still consider myself a Rhode Islander, and I can still consider myself a proud Rhode Islander. I just now consider myself a more educated Rhode Islander. And my work, or what I feel like my mission is to educate others. One of the things I tell, Marcus named some of these books, you've talked to some of these books, I read these books and I go look for the places and go look for the people. So I read the book Doc Work and made notes and looked for things and worked and went to the cemeteries that the people mentioned and looked into things. And I'm a fierce social media person, not good at it, fierce in looking up things and looking for people on it. And, I celebrate some of the same things. I will continue to go to the strawberry festivals. I will continue to go to Gatsby Days, but I keep in the back of my mind the truth behind those celebrations. And then I feel I share them with other people. So when we're talking about the conflict, Donna, really between the families, it's not a conflict as people think of in the family. It's a conflict between what these families did for Rhode Island positively and the truth behind how they did it. And how to sort of merge those two things so that we can still be proud of our heritage, but recognize that it wasn't all sunshiny, the state that was created by rogues looking for personal freedom and freedom to be. They were looking for freedom for white men to be, but not freedom for everybody.
Which is true.
So, happy to answer questions or say whatever, but that was quick and to the point, I think.
And I'll make a couple of quick comments. And ironically, one of the founders of our library, Roland Hazard, was involved in that. He was an abolitionist, but he was also in the middle of that trade as well, with the what they call Negro cloth. So that was a big deal. Interestingly enough, the mascot of South Kingstown High School is the rebel. And I think that's a real issue too. And nobody does anything about it, but that's where it is. So there's still some pieces of that history that we're living with. Yeah, go ahead, Debbie.
Well, I was just going to say, in this time period, these planters, the Hazards, the Robinsons, these planters were honored to be compared to their Southern brethren.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't a shame. It wasn't, and they consider, it's our property, our rights. South Kingston in particular, when slavery or the enslavement of people, lack of a better word, was outlawed or quote unquote outlawed. We know it didn't actually. The South Kingston folks rebelled every time. Mm-hmm. Every time. Nope, I'm keeping my, you will not tell me it's town rights. It's not. Rhode Island suffered greatly from this notion of state right versus town rights. Mm-hmm. And South Kingston and the Hazards and these families were not giving up their lifestyle. They were proud of it. It was their lifestyle. It was something they were proud of. Many of the gentlemen or men who entered the 1st Regiment came from South Kingston as a method to escape enslavement. I like to remind people, many of those people, yes, they volunteered, but those people were sold to the state of Rhode Island. People didn't just say, hey, take my slave and call it a day. There was a lot of money changing hand. I learned, that's how, quite frankly, I learned about my Tillinghast ancestors owning slaves, because it talked about how much money they got from the sale of their slaves to the state of Rhode Island.
Wow.
And then, and keep it in mind, they fought so bravely, and they came back to communities that didn't respect their fighting. Mm-hmm. And in fact, had them living in poverty that I don't think any of us can understand, kind of thing in many ways. That, so that's in South Kingston, they're the rebels and they're proud of it. And they're still proud of it. And like you said, I mean, I remind people, if you live down here and you go to Belmont's, and Belmont is in Dale Cartier's Dale Cartier Shopping Center, a center. Dale Carter was the name of the Niles family plantation.
Wow.
Right. No.
So the plantation's gone, but we kept the name and made it the most popular shopping center really in South County. So
I thought that was a World War II veteran. Okay.
Nope. It was the name of the plantation. Dale Cartier is a beautiful area in Europe that this Niles family and the families around there often talked about the plush lands and the grasslands and things like that. So when the Niles family came over, that's what they named their farm.
Wow.
And the farm then became, the farm left, the family ran out of money when, you divide it up, you start getting smaller and smaller, but the name remained. And we celebrate, I shop there, I go there, and until like I said, I grew up down here. But until I actually did a little research, I didn't know that's where it came from either.
Wow, wow. And mentioning the rebel as a mascot at South Kingstown High School, I think one reason is so hard to get rid of him as a mascot. I think a lot of the kids still identify with the rebel. So that's still a concern too. Okay. Any questions for Debbie? If not, this is a really nice way to go from Debbie to Shirley, because what Shirley will talk about will relate to what Debbie was talking about too. And she'll be talking about race, freedom, and military service.
All right, thanks, Donna. I'm just happy to be here with you all this evening, all the way from Toledo, Ohio, and everyone there is in Rhode Island, so that's pretty cool, especially since most of my research is in Rhode Island. I had opportunity just to piggyback on what Debbie and Marcus said earlier. I had the chance to teach American Revolution class this past semester. And usually what I do is I break it down in different components. And the first part of the course is the traditional narrative, what everyone knows about the American Revolution, right? And then the second part is the non-traditional narrative, the story we don't talk about. And in that part of the course is the narrative about slavery and the narrative about Native American soldiering and African American soldiering. And I am always surprised how little the students know about the influence and the impact of Native American soldiers and African American soldiers during the war. So that is always a great part of the semester that I enjoy. And they also don't know about the violence that went on as well. But this evening, and one more thing before I forget, Debbie, the Niles group, those Niles slaves, some of them are listed as serving in the Continental Army. So you might want to look into that as well. They're listed as Narragansett Indian and as African American. So there were some service of them during the Revolutionary War. So Donna mentioned earlier at the beginning during the introduction that our family has this really intriguing and interesting oral tradition. And it's about the service of two young freeborn African American men that served in the Continental Army in the Black Regiment out of Rhode Island. That is basically the Franklin oral tradition. And my dissertation is based on that. My dissertation is always also based on a lot of research in the historical files and military records as well. Yeah. But it starts with the Franklin oral tradition. And as I started to do my research, I was able to find out a little bit about the family background of those two brothers. Their names were William and Ben Frank. And they lived in a town called Johnston, Rhode Island, not too far from Providence. And their father was an individual by the name of Rufus Frank. And the story really starts with Rufus Frank and his military service. He lived and worked in Providence in the mid-1700s. He also fought in the French and Indian War. He fought as a member of the Providence militia. And he was basically stationed in upstate New York. And he was also stationed in Havana, Cuba, because when Spain jumped into the conflict towards the end of the war on the side of France, there were several Rhode Island troops that sailed out of New York Harbor, sailed down to Havana, Cuba, and laid siege to Havana. And Rufus Frank was part of those troops. They succeeded in their siege, and Rufus and his fellow troops returned back to mainland, and Rufus returned back to Rhode Island. I don't know if how much money he got out of his service during the French and Indian War. He is listed on several payrolls for that conflict, but it was enough money for him to move away from Providence and move to Johnstown. He got married there, he started a family, and he had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter's name was Hannah, and the 2 sons' names were William and Ben Frank. And they decided to follow their father's footsteps to serve in the military. Now, the Revolutionary War was a great opportunity for men of color in Rhode Island, free and enslaved, to try to improve their own condition through military service. For the freeborn men, there was their way of getting some sort of economic competence in way of enlistment bounties, land bounties, and pay, right? And for enslaved men, freedom could be gained through their military service. But their pathway to that military service was not too easy. Initially, the service for Black soldiers was outlawed. It was banned by General George Washington, which is something that the students are really surprised to hear about when we talk about our first president. What General Washington did when he took command of the militia forces that were surrounding Boston and tried to make a Continental Army out of them in the summer of 1775, he started to purge the Black soldiers from those armies, from those units. And that worked for a very, very brief period of time until November of 1775, when the Loyalist royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunsmore, issued a proclamation. And his proclamation said that if you are enslaved, and if you run to me, if you run to my cause, if you run to the British line, I'll give you your freedom. And quite a few slaves did that. Quite a few enslaved people ran to the British side because of Dunmore's proclamation. And George Washington had to counter that. And his counter initially was that he would allow the service of free Black veterans to come back into the military. That was his first gimme, right? And then later, a year later, he decided to allow, after a lot of prodding from his own command officers and African-American community leaders like Prince Hall, who came to him and said, listen, you need to let African-American men enlist and fight in the Continental Army. And he did. In January of 1777, he decided to allow all free Black men to serve in the Continental Army. About 5,000 to 7,000 Black soldiers, making up 10 to 15% of the Continental Army, served throughout the war. William and Ben Frank signed up early on in 1777. William, the oldest son, signed up first in April of 1777. He was around 17 years old, and his younger brother, Ben, signed up a month later when he was about 15 or 16 years old, and they went off to serve. What were they getting themselves into? Not very good service. The Continental Army was a mess, but initially they did serve in integrated regiments, which is pretty important to understand about military service during the Revolutionary War. Early on, the soldiers served in integrated companies and integrated regiments, and that's what William and Ben Frank signed up for. So if they were freeborn men and they're looking for equality, they got it because they got equal pay, they got equal bad conditions, but equal discipline as well. And that's early on. And they did have to suffer with poor equipment, insufficient pay, lack of supplies, lack of food. Soldiers had to forage for their own food throughout the war. Oftentimes in terms of shoes, they didn't have any shoes. So in the summertime, they went barefoot, and in the winter, they had to wrap their feet up with cloth. And that's what William and Ben had to deal with at a very young age. They're both teenagers at this point. And particularly for the Rhode Island Regiment, and William and Ben served in the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment early on in their careers. They also had to deal with the insults of their own countrymen, right? So the colonel of the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, a guy by the name of Israel Angel, he wrote to his superiors that the villagers would shout insults to his soldiers as they marched through town. The townspeople called his regiment the Ragged and Naked Regiment. Naked meaning they didn't have the appropriate clothing, attire, right? So this was the reality of life for in the Continental Army for the Frank brothers. They would fight in 2 major battles during the war. Early on, they fought in the Battle of Red Bank, and they also fought the major battle on their own home soil of the Battle of Rhode Island. They would survive both of those battles, and they would also survive the winter encampment of Valley Forge, which is probably the most famous winter encampment during the Revolutionary War, even though the encampment a couple years later was worse. But everyone always talks about the winter encampment of Valley Forge, the summer of 1777 to 1778. All right, during that encampment, there were a lot of desertions because of the poor supplies and the conditions. There were also a lot of deaths. William and Ben lost company mates during that tough winter. A lot of the soldiers, over 2,800 of them, were deemed unfit for duty by General George Washington himself. William Frank was one of those soldiers, meaning he didn't have enough equipment, didn't have shoes, didn't have the equipment to stay in sentry, more than likely. But it was during this encampment, during this winter encampment, that the conditions of service for the Frank brothers and the other freeborn men, soldiers of color, started to change. Up to this point, William and Ben Frank served in integrated regiments alongside of 50 other soldiers of color, African Americans and Native Americans, most of them from the Narragansett Nation. So they were already in service. But because they lost so many soldiers during that winter encampment at Valley Forge, the Rhode Island command officers went to Washington and explained to him that they could raise a battalion of Blacks that were formerly enslaved. And they were able to convince George Washington of something he never wanted to do in terms of granting freedom to former slaves in lieu of military service. But his hands were tied. So he agreed with them. And as a result of that, the Rhode Island State Assembly passed the Slave Enlistment Act of 1778. And basically the act stipulated this, and I'm going to read it to you, that every able-bodied Negro, mulatto, Indian man, slave in this state may enlist into either of the said 2 battalions to serve during the continuance of the present war with Great Britain, that every slave so enlisting shall be entitled to and receive all bounties, wages, and encouragements allowed by the Continental Congress to any soldier enlisting into their service. It is further voted and resolved that every slave so enlisting shall be immediately discharged from the service of his master or mistress and be absolutely free. And the act also provided that the slave owners would be compensated for their losses. Now, as a result of the Slave Enlistment Act, at least 32 formerly enslaved men from South County enlisted because of the act. 2 of them were Caesar and Moses Updike of North Kingston. Caesar would serve until the end of the war. And there were other free Blacks and Native Americans that also enlisted during this time period. And their names are included on a document entitled The Return of Freemen. William and Ben Frank are listed on that return, along with individuals like Simon Barton and Peter Daly that enlisted at Warwick. Caesar Finch and Prince Lemus came from the town of East Greenwich. Tony Phillips and Joseph Boyer joined in May of 1778 from the North Kingston area. So, but what happened as a result of this new inclusion of former slaves into the Rhode Island regiments? It caused a major reorganization among the Rhode Island troops, and it also caused the segregation of the Rhode Island Continentals. Approximately 50 free men of color and approximately 100 former slaves were assigned to the newly reconfigured 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which became known as the Black Regiment. At least 15 soldiers of color, including the Frank brothers, were reassigned from the 2nd Rhode Island to the 1st Rhode Island. Over 100 white soldiers transferred from the 1st Rhode Island to the 2nd Rhode Island. One of those white soldiers, a guy by the name of William Champlin, he was a private. He recalled his reassignment to the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment in very simple terms in his pension application. He said that all the white men in the 1st Rhode Island were transferred to Colonel Israel Angel's regiment, which was the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment. Didn't really say why, but that transfer was made. And that is the only written document that I can find to explain why this shift of personnel was made. Everything else is just a guess and a theory on my part. The Black Regiment is best known for its participation in the Battle of Rhode Island, which took place in August of 1778. The soldiers of the 1st Rhode Island were assigned to hold a position near Butts Hill. A monument to the regiment, it was dedicated in 2005 near that location in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. During the battle, the 1st Rhode Island were able to repel 3 separate charges by a combination of British and Hessian forces. They lost 30 that were killed, 137 were wounded, 44 came up missing. So that was a pretty difficult and intense battle for them. After that battle, though, they were assigned to duty in their home state for the remainder of the year and throughout the winter season of 1779 and 1780. They were initially assigned to guard Newport and Providence, while the rest of the Continental Army was at winter encampment at Morristown, New Jersey. While stationed in isolation there from the rest of the Army, General Washington ordered the Black Regiment to construct fortifications for the rest of the Continental Army. This is a major shift in what they were originally designated to do. This was a change from being in combat mode to support mode. And that would be a major shift for the veterans of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, right? They're being treated differently now. And this may have reflected in their acting out as described by their commander, Colonel Christopher Green. In a letter to General Washington, Green wrote, quote, "I should be very happy if companies of my regiment was called from the state to join the Army, as I am very confident they would be of more service to the public when carried from their acquaintances and connections." So Colonel Green is really basically saying that his regiment is being segregated from the rest of the Continental Army, and they understand that they're now being treated differently. It was also during this period of time that Ben Frank, the younger brother, got married. He married a young woman by the name of Sarah Wilbur. I don't know why these young soldiers get married, but they do, and he did. He was 17 years old at the time. Sarah was also the mother of one child, Abraham. And it was at this point in his life, a year after his marriage, that Ben Frank made a pivotal decision. So let's review his life up to this point. He's 17 or 18 years old. He's married, he has a family support. He's serving with an army that can't afford to clothe him and feed him. He and his fellow soldiers are called the Naked Ragged Regiment. He survived a miserable winter at Valley Forge, fought in 2 battles, survived them, but during both battles, they had to retreat. He lost comrades in both battles, and he may have been convinced America was not going to win the war. So what did he do? He deserted. In March of 1780, he deserted from the Continental Army, which was not uncommon for Revolutionary War soldiers to leave their companies and regiments for home. 1/3 to 1/2 deserted during the war. As I stated before, poor pay, equipment, lack of food, even homesickness drove many of these soldiers to desert and go back home. Some soldiers left because they were experiencing combat fatigue or because they were sick. Others left because they had farms or businesses to take care of. Ben probably left for a combination of all of those reasons, personal and professional. The one thing Ben could not do was to go back home. He could not go back home to Johnston, Rhode Island, and explain to his father, a military veteran, that he left his brother in service back in Rhode Island, in camp. So Ben did not do that. We'll talk about what happens to him a little bit. But William continued his service with the Rhode Island Regiment. He may have felt responsible to uphold the family name. He may have felt a sense of loyalty to his fellow soldiers in the Rhode Island Regiment. Probably didn't want to jeopardize his chances of getting any land or money at the end of his service. And he may have believed that they were going to win. So he re-enlisted in February of 1781. A couple of months before he re-enlisted, though, the Congress reorganized the Continental Army again, and the 2 Rhode Island regiments were consolidated into 1 regiment. And in December of 1780, the surviving members or soldiers of the Black Regiment marched across frozen grounds to meet the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment at West Point. And upon their arrival, they became the consolidated 1st Rhode Island Regiment again, and the story of the Black Regiment ended. And you had the Native American and Black veterans of the Rhode Island regiments had basically come full circle, starting and ending their service in integrated regiments. William was honorably discharged at the end of the war. He served a total of 6 years. He was 23 years old upon his discharge. Of the 35 men that were listed on that return of freemen that I talked about earlier, only 16 of them survived the war. That included Simon Barton, Joseph Boyer, Prince Lemus, and William Frank were among those 16. The average length of those soldiers was 5 years, so William served an additional year more than anyone else did. He would eventually get his back pay. He would eventually get his land bounty, which he promptly sold to a land speculator. And after war, he settled back in Johnston, Rhode Island, and started a family there. His brother Ben's life was a little bit more complicated. After Ben left the Continental Army, Donna's shaking her head because she knows where this is going. He signed up for the British cause. He claims to have served primarily in South Carolina. At the end of the war, many of the defeated British troops and all the loyalists, including Black loyalists among them, made their way to Long Island, the last British stronghold in America. They remained there until the final peace treaty was negotiated and passage would be arranged for them to leave. Part of the treaty promised the return of all confiscated property to its rightful American owners, which included enslaved people. However, British officials refused to return many of those fugitive slaves that had run to the British as a result of Dunsmore Proclamation and the Phillipsburg Proclamation after that. But the British were willing to make fair compensation to their owners, to their American owners. And in order to do so, they had to compile an inventory of all the Blacks within British lines. And this inventory became known as the Book of Negroes. Ben Frank is listed in that book. But if you look for him under Ben Frank, you're not going to find him because he was smarter than that. He listed himself as Ben Frankham. He, along with 3,000 other Black loyalists, are listed in the Book of Negroes. In October of 1783, at war's end, Ben Frankham is on a ship taking him and others to Nova Scotia. He was part of a fleet of over 80 ships and 40,000 loyalists that were heading to Nova Scotia. At one point, Ben lived in the settlement of Birchtown, Nova Scotia, the largest free Black settlement in North America. Had a population of over 1,500 Blacks that lived there. Ben, now calling himself Ben Franklin, eventually married the daughter of another Black loyalist, He settled in a small town called Granville Ferry. Ben and his second wife had 8 children. 7 survived into adulthood. All were baptized in the Anglican Church, and he passed away sometime after 1838. So one of his descendants is my grandfather, our grandfather, John William Franklin. John left Nova Scotia for New York City looking for work in the early 1900s. Following the Frank/Franklin tradition, John served in World War I as part of the New York Regiment. He married late in life. He settled in Massachusetts. He passed away in 1966. His 2 sons are uncles, John William Franklin II and Benjamin Franklin. Check out the names, John, William, and Ben again. Both of them served in World War II and the Korean conflict.
Yeah.
And they carried on the family tradition of military service. I just want to say one more thing about genealogy and its importance. And I'm going to talk about Tony Burroughs. Tony Burroughs is probably the best, well, outside of Henry Gates. Tony Burroughs is the African-American genealogist. He's written books on it. And he goes on to say this. He says that the significance of family historical research can be separated into 4 main areas. Number 1, to provide heritage for children. Number 2, as a method to understand one's family. Number 3, to foster pride and self-esteem. And number 4, to learn about history, right? So the Franklin story achieves all of those goals, I think. It fostered pride and provides heritage for generation of Franklin children by attaching their collective histories to a group of individuals with a historical identity, like American patriots, like the Black Loyalists. It provides a background for the Frank military tradition, something that we could really start to understand. It helped Franklins to know and understand the idea that family did not stop at national boundaries, and it provided Franklin family members with a way to put their story in a greater national and international perspective. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Shirley?
I love that. That's excellent. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Marcus and
Just briefly, I'm gushing because that's a movie, I should say.
Thank you.
But immediately, 2 books come to mind, and I'm curious, you've likely come across them. One is Harvey Amani Whitfield's Blacks on the Border.
Yes, I met him. He's amazing.
Yes, and then
Great
the other
book.
is
Yes.
this one.
I met her.
I thought that you would be familiar with both. And as I'm listening to you tell their stories, I'm just thinking of those books more broadly and the framing that your family's history provides.
Right.
The grounding that it provides for that scholarly framing is just, it's magnificent.
Thank you.
Was not a question at all. It's totally me.
Ruth Herndon was my dissertation advisor, and we talked about how to put together the dissertation, and we started to describe it as a rotary, that the Frank brothers and the Frank family were at the center of this rotary, and then all of these other avenues shoot off of them. And sometimes it's really hard to stay focused on them because you could get carried away talking about the Black Loyalists or get carried away talking about the Black Regiment, and it was sometimes hard to stay focused on the Frank brothers. Thank you for the comments.
No, Shirley, I love the way when you're talking about it, talking about your ancestry. It's what I tell when I do my workshops, using your ancestry to ground history, to talk about from start to finish what was going on and how and I think for kids in particular, that's the way to teach history. That's the way to get them that it's not just something that happened. It's something that happened in your family's past. It's funny when I do that, I don't know about how you feel, but sometimes I feel like I know these people.
Right,
sometimes
yeah.
I'm like, Debbie, you've lost your mind. You're talking to somebody who died 200 years ago. Knock it off. And I just find like when you have that, that's one of the things about living in Rhode Island, having that stuff at my fingertips in many ways, is I do find myself talking to my ancestors and understanding better. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember. No, Deb, you don't remember when that happened. That was 300 years ago. That wasn't you. Like I have to remind myself sometimes. So,
I think when it's about family, you try to understand the motivation behind their actions.
Exactly.
And I tell the students that I probably understand William more because I'm an oldest child too. I probably understand William more than Ben, but I also understand where Ben's coming from too. And I think the story of these two brothers talks about shifting allegiances, right? And you have to really understand where African Americans are coming from during the Revolutionary era, whose side they were going to pick, right? Who's going to treat them more fairly? Who's going to free them? And those things could shift throughout the war. And I think that helps them to understand that a little bit better.
Shirley, I listened to a presentation a couple of years ago about the Rhode Island 1st Regiment in particular. That was the focus of the presentation, but somebody in the audience, I can't remember who it was, brought up that Washington, even though he allowed the enslaved folks to participate in the regiment, his intention wasn't, it was Rhode Island's intention to grant them their freedom, not necessarily Washington's, because he still saw them as the property. So when he took property, he sort of thought about giving property back, kind of thing, if that made any sense and what your thoughts are on that.
Washington was really pushed to allow Black men to serve. He was pushed by his own command officers because these officers had commanded these individuals in these integrated militia groups, these integrated militia companies that came out of all these towns in New England. He was pushed by and Prince Hall. And then by the time he got to Valley Forge winter encampment, it was so difficult to put it together enough people from Rhode Island to make 2 regiments. And he finally just acquiesced and said, all right, I'll allow these formerly enslaved people to serve. But that didn't last very long. So it only lasted they passed the act in February of 1778. They passed another act in May of 1778 saying, we changed our mind. We don't want that to happen anymore. So it didn't last very long. And a lot of the slaveholders, the Hazards and individuals that you all mentioned earlier this evening were pushing back against that to happen, to continue to happen. Because they didn't feel comfortable with it. They did not feel comfortable giving Native Americans and African Americans guns. That's it.
Okay. Before I go on the last subject, any questions from our audience in general? Laurel, can you unmute?
Sorry about that. So I wanted to kind of test a little here where the audience right now is now just a few, Liz and Jessica. If Jessica or Liz, can you raise your hand or do something where I could see how it looks? And, oh, there's Liz. All right, Liz, I'm going to click on allow you to talk, and I just want to see what it looks like from here. So go ahead, Liz.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just want to say you are all phenomenal. And Marcus, if I weren't 70 years old, I'd come back and take a class with you at URI. Very articulate. I really, and I didn't major in history or any of that. So it's very interesting what you were discussing. All of you were great. I had no idea what to expect, although Donna had given us your bios, and I said to her, very impressive. But this is really interesting. I mean, just to tell you a little background, I mean, I'm Jewish. My family didn't come over to this country from Eastern Europe till the early 1900s. So you guys have been here and your family's way ahead. Of course, my family was also, though, having a lot of trouble. They had to leave or I wouldn't be here right now.
That's
So,
the truth. Yeah.
It's just all of your discussions I found fascinating, and I hope we can do something. I think you know about the Weaver sculpture at the library. That's what started this going, because it's the 100th anniversary of that sculpture that was donated by the Hazards, right, Jessica, Laurel? But
correct. Anyway. It was commissioned by Carolyn Hazard in honor of her brothers, and we know that most of their money was made from the textile industry.
Right.
As much as they were community players, you have to look at the whole big picture.
So I don't have any questions, but I just want to tell you I really enjoyed all of your presentations, and I hope we can do something with this. There's already a lot of history on our website for the library, and you know, this would be a great addition. So thank you very much.
Thanks,
you.
Liz.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. I'm sure there's a way you can audit classes at URI too. Feel free.
You're right. I think there are for us
Yes, there is,
retired
Liz.
folks.
And I work at URI, I wrote Marcus's name down too, so he'll be looking in one of his classes and I'll be waving in the background. Yes, it's me.
Okay.
Jessica, did you have any questions? Unmute.
Oh, sorry.
Here she is.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
You are
Yes,
now.
we can hear
Yes.
you.
I wanted to echo what Liz said, and thank you all for your presentations, which were all of them fascinating. I prepared, as some of you know, a extensive bibliography on the legacy of slavery in South Kingstown that's on the library website. And there were a couple of books that were mentioned tonight that I'm going to add to it. First, though, I just want to say I never met Ruth Herndon, but I did meet Ella Sikataw, and she spoke twice at our library. And
Oh,
Uh-oh.
oh, we lost her.
She's back.
All right,
Uh-oh.
am I still there?
You're
Yep,
back.
you're back.
there you are. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I have a couple of articles in the vertical file somewhere that Ella and Ruth Herndon collaborated on that I kept for the library. And I wanted to say to Debbie also, I grew up in Narragansett as well. And none of this was ever mentioned. Absolutely nothing. But I want to say I have a theory about why people in the 20th and 21st centuries don't know anything about it. And that was that in the 19th century, there was a cover-up. There were people, and Caroline Hazard, for all, you know, all the many ways she's worthy of admiration, my opinion is that she did everything she could to minimize the participation of the earlier generations of her family in slavery. And evidently what happened was that, you know, the Hazards came over here in 16 something. They, you know, like a lot of the people who came over here from England, they started these agricultural operations, but one of the Hazard sons, a few generations down, found the institution of slavery abhorrent and, you know, wouldn't participate in it. And in order to hold that opinion, he risked, you know, being disowned by his father. So a lot of her writing was, you know, celebrating him and saying, well, I mean, you know, the gist of it seemed to me to be, well, yes, we own slaves, but, you know, we were terribly troubled by it. And, you know, eventually we got out of it. What was left out of her equation was what happened to the wealth that was created by all those enslaved people that worked for them. Somehow it seems to me it stayed in the family.
Exactly.
So, you know, and there's another book that wasn't mentioned tonight, but that I found very revealing on this subject, called something like Black Lives, White Lands, and Native History, or something like that. The writer is Jared Hardesty, and he teaches at the University of Western Washington. Maybe some of you know him, I don't know. But he has a chapter on one of the Roland Hazards, who you know, tried and failed in a number of business ventures and eventually got the mill in Peacedale going. And Hardesti's point about that Roland Hazard was that he was able to do it because of inherited wealth. And I think that's such an important point. So that's one book that I mentioned. Also, Shirley, I was just enthralled with your story of the military history and the fact that it is possible to put together even now such a detailed history and picture of the lives of people who participated in that back then. And, you know, I'm just so thrilled to hear that this cover up and this amnesia is being broken through. So that was a very thrilling story to me to hear. And Marcus, I want to say, after Shirley spoke, you held up 2 books, and I missed the second one. The first one was Blacks on the Border. What was the second one? Oh, Epic Journeys of Freedom. Okay, thank you.
Marcus is going to send me a list of all the books he mentioned when he spoke, so we could add whatever we don't have.
I'm proud to say of the 5 you mentioned initially, Marcus, 4 of them are already on my bibliography, and these other 3 are going to go on there.
Excellent, because I was trying to write them down quickly, and and I'm looking at my writing now, and I'm like, yeah, you don't know what that word is. So whatever you wrote is not really a word, kind of thing. And Jessica, just throwing out what you were just talking about, Roland Hazard, I'm looking at right now. Like I said, I printed off some things, and one of the things that's funny, because they talked about Roland Hazard and the Hazard family at this point not wanting to have slaves, being anti-slavery, but this is a document talking about his trip down to Baton Rouge, which we're going to assume means Baton Rouge, having been absent for 12 days and visiting 300 plantations, selling, scattering their clothing, selling them to planters, generally throughout the area. So, you know, that's that's where it's at. Like it's enough said right there.
You know, the definitely involved. Although after 1840 something, that Roland Gibson Hazard, that guy, he got out of it. I think he couldn't stand it anymore, and he left
this was from 1835. This piece that he did. Yeah,
and there's a film about that Roland Hazard called something like Carolina, the Smallest of the Small, by Carla Ritchie. And she, so she immersed herself in that Roland Hazard to the point where she told me her husband thought she might have fallen in love with him. But from her study of his life, she said she thought he was always conflicted by the fact that, you know, he made so much money, and his family's enterprise depended on, you know, slavery being there, even though he was so against it. So, you know, he evidently had that internal conflict. And I confess, I haven't read his weighty tomes about, you know, philosophy and stuff that he wrote, but I'm sure that within them that some of that conflict would emerge. But he was the grandfather of Caroline Hazard, who wrote all that, what I consider revisionist material about, you know, yeah, our family did that way back, but look at all this great stuff we've done since then, which is true. They did a bunch of great stuff. I wouldn't have a job if that library wasn't there. And, you know, the family with all that inherited wealth, they didn't just keep it and play golf and stuff. They built schools. They, you know, she got the hospital going. And, you know, the town hall was a Hazard gift to the town. So,
and the guild, I imagine, too.
And yeah, the neighborhood guild as well. So, you know, these things are very complex, and you can't, it seems to me, you can't just discount the contributions of a particular family because way back they owned slaves and, you know, later they did this and that. This was something that happened over multiple generations. You know, different individuals were involved, and they were each a product of their time. So, you know, it takes the kind of scholarship that all of you have done and, you know, presenting it together so that everybody else can see the complexity that's involved. And I'm just thrilled that, thanks Laurel for including me in this. And I just found it really, really fascinating and enriching. I'm glad to meet all of you and hear about your work. So thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. And I think, and hopefully, you know, we'll come back with you guys at some future point, because I think this went really well. I think there's a lot that we just kind of tipped, and I really like, and Donna, I'll jump right in here saying, you know, like, we can find more information. We can encourage people to find more information. There's so many. Debbie, I love what you said about you read something and I'm just going to go look for it. You know, I'm just going to go find it. And that's kind of what library is about. That's what, you know, the human intellect's about, as long as we're willing to open our minds and, excuse me, and just, and, you know, be lifelong learners and be learners of the truth instead of that amnesia or not, you know, considering the past can help shape our future if we you know, choose to pay attention. So
I will tell you just one other book you might want to consider. It's not specific to Rhode Island, but this was my COVID summer vacation. Is I have the book African American Historic Burial Grounds. And actually we had a good time. We went through Maine and New Hampshire looking at them, and that's where I learned about the Rhode Island ones, and we just grabbed the book and start looking for them. I mean, it's more than just, I mean, it's the sculpture work on when they do have headstones, everything, just a good time. And people, you know, people were like, you know, Deb, that's a little odd. I'm not interested, but they're not interested enough to ask me questions every time I talk about, and everybody's obsessed now that I know whether I found this Gardner Stanton burial ground in Rhode Island, which I have not, but when I do, everybody thinks it's weird, but everybody asks about it every single time that I'm hunting for it. And that's everybody.
And before we call it an evening, Debbie and Shirley, anything else you'd like to say to the audience about the joys of genealogy?
It's a joy.
It's a joy. It's time consuming. You can go down the rabbit hole really quickly, but it's just, I don't know, it's just overwhelming when you find out new stuff about your own family.
It's overwhelming. It's fun. One of the things I have been doing for my cousins, all my cousins are significantly younger than I am, is I each year for Christmas give them a genealogy book about one side of the family, where I just include all the pictures, the stories, the timeline. I mean, I couldn't sell it and say, oh, it's a written academic work. It's just everything I've collected, and I've gone through each line kind of thing, and that's what I give them for Christmas. My dream is doing that on my dad's side. It's just, as you all know who do genealogy, Marcus, you've talked about doing genealogy in the South, so much more difficult than a family that didn't leave a state for 300 and something years kind of thing.
The other thing I've done is I have 5 grandchildren, and they all know about the fact that they have ancestors that fought in the Revolutionary War. So when they're in grade school or high school, I make sure that they raise their hand when the teacher's talking about it. Say, yeah, my ancestors, and the teachers are just dumbstruck, like, what? What did you just say? So that's always a lot of fun too.
And I'll put in a plug for the library. Again, we have ancestry.com for folks with library cards. South Kingstown library cards, or actually I think most of Rhode Island is offering that if you have Public Library card, you can log in to ancestry.com and get a little started.
I'll put in a plug for your library too, from a Rhode Island standpoint, doing ancestry. It's got one of the best genealogy rooms in the state. Before COVID, I was in there. It's really one of the best, and I've been to a lot of them and looked at a lot, and one of the best. And I know, Jessica, a lot of that is yourself because you work with the Daughters of the American Revolution and things like that, and it's fabulous.
Well, a lot of it was there before I got there, so I can't take too much credit.
Oh, no, take credit.
But you know, I did try to build up the collection with you know, books about African American history in Rhode Island, New England, and King Philip's War. So you know, I keep an eye out for those, and you know, we own copies in the library of most of the books that were mentioned tonight.
Good.
So yeah, thank you for that plug of the Rhode Island History Room, and I'm glad you found it so useful.
Yep.
If only we could get that building open.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother conversation. We are closed to the public, but open for curbside. So I will put that in there for, we want you to run right out to the library, but not quite yet.
Yeah.
I did just want to say, Debbie, when you were reciting those names of all those New England all those families, when you were talking about the Nileses and the Hazards and the Wilcoxes, those are all Narragansett names.
Yep.
I mean, those are the names that we go by. So
Oh yeah.
whatever, you know, so sometimes I'm like, well, gee, I'm not sure how many descendants of those original folks are around, but their names, you know, they're now they belong to us, you know.
Exactly.
You know, so it's like, I feel when you were reciting those names off, I was like, those are the names of home. Those are the names that are people, because I'm like, my grandma, I'm a Stanton on my mother's side, and I'm, you know, I've got, you know, then the Nileses have always been another big name, and my aunt is married. We're all married into everybody, but you know, Wilcoxes and just right up and down the list. Those are the names.
100%. I mean, in reality now, the names of these Rhode Island planters, the people of color that bear these names, whether they're indigenous folks, Native Americans, or whether they're African Americans, far outnumber the people of European descent that have these names, far outnumber. I, quite frankly, told you, grew up down here, didn't know a European descent Stanton. Every Stanton I know, and I have Stanton friends, left, right, and sideways, are all people of color.
And I know quite a few Hazards, and none of them are white.
Yep, the whole thing.
That's a big family.
It's just, it's an amazing, and again, growing up down here, like you, Jessica, I went to school with the Stantons, the Hazards, the Perrys, all these people, and never made a connection between plantations. And so, you know, you grow up, you learn a little bit, and that's what I hope that panels like this do, and research that everybody's doing, that we can make a connection, that there's connections, and there's, you know, and it pushes what's going on today. I think once we made the connection with people in the state about Rhode Island, the role of slavery, and the people were more willing to look at the name again and say, you know, maybe Rod, you didn't mean that, but it's what it means now, and it's got to go because it's hurtful and impactful to our neighbors. And that was my push kind of thing.
And Liz, you have your hand up. Can you talk, or was it up from before?
I guess I was just going to add that, in a way, it's interesting. I don't know if you people know how this came about. First of all, to me, it was the 100th anniversary.
Oops.
Whoops.
Oops.
Oh shoot.
There she is.
There she is.
Am I there?
Yes.
Oh no, I got lost.
No, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
All right, good. But I was just going to say that, you know, it was the 100th anniversary of the sculpture. I mean, this is, I think we start talking about this before COVID?
Yeah, we did.
But also then, okay, so COVID came, but then there was all the Black Lives Matter and the stuff happening around the United States, Frank Lloyd and all this. It all just sort of, to me, seemed to just come together. You know, it's like, wow, this was even happening in Rhode Island you know, over 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So if it weren't for that sculpture, I'm not sure we'd be doing this, Laurel.
Right.
I don't know if you agree
might
with
be
that.
right. I think you're right. It started a conversation, and then when we
Yeah.
looked at a bigger picture and also looked around us, more than just at the sculpture or at the library, that we looked at, you know, where, you know, history. We kind of had to look at the whole bigger picture. You have a good point there, Liz.
Well, and just thinking, eventually we want to celebrate the 100th anniversary. You know, it was given to the library in 1920, but we're not going to be able to do it this